Hey folks, part two of my making myself a new 5-yard kilt from this lovely cloth that was I would say an over purchase. The customer had selected this tartan for his kilt. It's the Childers Gurkha tartan. And it's not a regimental tartan as such. According to what I read in the tartan registry, somebody in the War Department of the British government in the late 1800s designed this tartan, named it after his boss, who was I believe the war minister at the time, Mr. Childers, hopefully, I guess, in a bid to get promoted. And then later on, one of the Gurkha regiments, and I can't remember which regiment it was, of the British Indian Army, selected this to be the tartan worn by their pipers for a shoulder plate and I believe also for trews and pipe bag covers. So we had a bit of back and forth about it, and we decided that it wasn't really a kind of a stolen valor thing, because this wasn't an organic development within the regiment. It was designed by a person, and then an officer of whatever Gurkha rifles it was took a look at that and said, that's what we want. So we just chose it because it's really nice, you know. So what I had done yesterday, well, you saw my previous video, but yesterday I managed to get all of the pleats sewn in one session, and fun. Yeah, I mean, there's only 14 pleats, 13 now, because what I wanted to experiment with, initially I sewed them as a knife pleat, and then when I looked at it, the problem with when knife pleats get beyond a certain width at the hip and at the bottom, you can get sort of a jagged kind of, I can't really do it on, well, I can sort of see this sort of effect. You get this sort of sawtooth effect at the bottom, so, which isn't a good look. So one of my 5-yard kilts, or one of my little kilts, shall we say, small kilt, I have one box pleat and one knife pleat kilt, and I've also sewn my version of a historic army kilt of the early 1800s, and had found that I'd sewn it as a knife pleat and then not done anything else, not even steeking it, and wearing it, something about the action of the cloth when moving or something, it kind of turned itself into sort of a rudimentary box pleat, right? I can't explain how exactly that occurred, but looking also from my years and years of experience of working with army kilts, it's evident to me when I'm taking them apart to resew them that in the past they weren't doing the same thing I do, which is I fold the first seam, and I think I've shown this elsewhere. I fold the first crease and baste it in throughout the 31 pleats, and then sew the kilt together, and then press it a second time. But from looking inside the old kilts that I've taken apart, it's clear to me that they didn't do it that way. They did it a different way. So the next army box pleat kilt that I do, I'm going to baste that first press, or that first crease, only up to the bottom of the fell, and not press it forward, because I'll sew this as a knife pleat and then baste the bottom as a box pleat and see if that works. But in any case, so back to this thing, I sewed it as a knife pleat, and I went, that's really not going to be effective because you're going to get that jagged effect. So I thought, remembering that other kilt, I said, well, what if I tried to turn it into a box pleat now, having sewn it as a knife pleat? So what I did was I took, because the knife pleat lays like that, as you can see. But what I did with each of these, starting on the left, because I want to start on the edge where I'm only pinning that cloth together. If I start at this edge, I'm potentially pinning several layers together. And if I get it right here, I don't want to have to think about whether I'm getting it right over here when I'm pinning on this side. So I start on the side with the least amount of cloth, and then work my way across. So what I did, I sort of split this deep pleat in half, because looking at the cloth here, the midpoint between the two red lines on the outside of the kilt is right there. I'll just mark it with chalk, right? So by splitting that and pinning it in place, as we see here, I should achieve a box pleat, right? So, and incidentally, my conscience is clear. I've already put in an 11-hour work day. So now this is my, this is me having some fun on, now that I've done the paying work for the day. But yeah, so I pinned it all down and I thought, okay, I'm onto something here. Maybe this is going to work. But I won't do all of this because I'm going to flip it over again in a minute. There we go. Now, I should say at this point that having pinned it up like this, I'm still not inclined to thin the back out. I'm still not inclined to fish it because that's not as much cloth as we would have in an 8-yard kilt, and I don't think it's going to be oppressively warm. It's certainly not oppressively warm on the 5-yard, the small box pleat kilt that I've made, the other one I've made. So great, I thought now I just have to base these in place and press it. But the problem that I ran into was if I base that down into a box, that's fine. But if I based this one, because on a box pleat kilt, as I mentioned elsewhere, in I think it's with the playlist How to Make a Seaforth Highlanders Kilt, I found that the first and the last pleat have to be knife pleats pointing towards the center of the back. Because if we do these end pleats as box pleats, eventually gravity and motion and everything else, they're going to become knife pleats on their own. So I decided better effect to sew them as knife pleats to begin with, because that's what the cloth really, really wants to do. But yeah, so having sewn it as a knife pleat, but then pulled that cloth back into the box shape, I'm getting a very, very shallow fold here, really shallow. But then, because that's pleat number 13, when I bring the apron into place, actually apron, wherever my mark is, yeah, a really, really shallow fold like that is going to turn up when you're wearing the kilt. This is going to curl out, which we sometimes see. So okay, you know, that wasn't a wasted 3 hours of sewing this thing up. I believe that I've proven to my satisfaction that sewing it as a knife pleat and then boxing the pleats doesn't work. So I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to pick these seams apart, and then I'm going to go back to the beginning and sew it as a box pleat from the beginning. And the way we do that is sewing each of these to that center I talked about, there and there. Now the first and the last pleat will be a knife pleat. Whether that has to be a deep pleat or not remains to be seen. So there we go. Live and learn. So I'm going to unpick all of these seams. I might have to buy some more of this thread because I'm starting to see I'm starting to see the bobbin through the layers of thread. So I'm running out of this stuff. So I might have to make a trip over tomorrow to get more thread. But there we go. I'll thus far though, I mean, aside from that, I really like the pleating, the effect of pleating to the stripe, because we have a good balance of color, all elements of the tartan, and I think it looks more striking than pleating to the set. It's sort of my default setting. I find pleating to the set to be a bit boring to look at. So there we go. I'm not going to unpick this tonight because I've already opened a beer. But yeah, I'm going to leave this. Pull all the pins out of it first, but I'm going to leave this, and then after my day's work is done tomorrow, I will reward myself by doing some more sewing on this. Yeah. Okay. you don't want to watch me in real time pulling out all those damn pins. So I'll say goodnight and talk to you later. Well, here we are again. I think this is part 3 of me puzzling out how to make a small kilt, a filet beg, as opposed to a filet mort. I remember previous episode I'd sewed it up as a knife pleat, and then based on my experience of a short kilt sewn up into the knife pleat and not having any other tailoring, no steeking, no cutting out in the back, that eventually with wear it kind of shifted itself into sort of a proto box pleat, and I tried to sew it up and then fiddle it around, and it didn't work. So what I'm doing now, based on the last time I did this, my 4.5 yard something Seaforth kilt. So what I've done is I've unpicked, I haven't unpicked all of them, but I've unpicked the first few. And I've sewn the first pleat, starting from the left hip, as a knife pleat pointing towards the middle of the kilt. And then started the second pleat. Now I'm going to show you how the method that I can't say maybe I've hit on, but if I've sort of discovered this myself, it was in the past. But I've rediscovered it, let's put it this way. So to pin up the next pleat, because what I'm going to do is baste them all, and then sew all the fills, and then press it. So as you can see there, these two are basted. So my next step, because the center point between these two red elements is the middle of the black there, isn't it? So just by eye, I'm marking the center of that. And then I've already marked with my gauges. Remember, there's 1 5/8 at the hip, and 1 3/8 at the waist. And once again, having these gauges is such a time-saving and frankly kind of fun shortcut, coupled with my tables, remember, that I'd made up for pleat widths. Although when I'm working with something like this, I have to increase the table, don't I? Because my normal table goes from 3/8 to 1 inch. So, but that's just a simple bit of adding up, isn't it? So there, so I got the center marked, the halfway point, shall we say. Now I'm going to bring the seam over, and the pleat in the middle is sort of getting in my way, so you can't see, I'm folding it back there, so that I'm not sewing more than the one pleat at a time. And a couple of people have asked about whether it's a good idea to pin and sew multiple pleats at the same time, to wit, that the cloth is folded so that when you're sewing the first pleat, you would also be passing through the pleats of the folded back part of the pleat, the underside of the pleat of the next few. And I really can't see any advantage to it. I think perhaps that'll be the topic of a separate video. Okay, so I'm dressing up my chalk lines here, and pinning, and pinning, and pinning, and pinning, and there, and there. Now, good. Okay, so there's one. See, I could base those two now, but why don't I just add the next one? Pardon me, because I can see my old chalk marks, but I'm just going to reconfirm them there. One, and again, remember, I'm doing this along its length. And I think this is actually, you know, granted, I'd experimented with that other way, but I found that I think this really is the way that's going to save the most time. Not that I'm pressed for time, right? If you're not willing to take the time to do it right, and you know, it's another aspect of fast fashion, you know, shops that are a little too eager to get the work done and out the door. if you're in a hurry, maybe you should be in another line of work. Of course, if you're a hobbyist, you're absolutely in the best position because you don't have to worry about so much about your bottom line because you're not paying yourself. All right, here we go. I got lots of pins over there in the bucket, so. Now, there. And now I will baste these two. And then I'm just going to carry on to the end. I'll tune in. I'll come back. The next episode will be when I reach the last pleat. Because remember, it's going to be a knife pleat as well, pointing the other direction towards the middle of the back because I found that to be the best practice. So there we go. I'm going to bash through and baste all of this and put it to one side and then get back to the paying work for all of those people who are so very patient waiting for me to make their kilts. Thank you and have a good weekend. Here we are for the next installment of this 5-yard kilt that I'm making for myself. Continuing directly from the last episode, you can see I've basted the box pleats into place. The first and the last being knife pleats because that's what the cloth is going to want to do anyway. So from here, I'm going to start, not right away, probably not today, almost certainly not today because I got paying work to do. But I'm going to start, the next stage is to start sewing the fell seams. And I'm going to do two things about that. I'm going to go over to the thread shop, specialty thread shop that I know of in Vancouver, and get myself some cotton thread because I fell into a bad habit. I was using polyester when I sewed this last. And I'm starting to think that my opinion of polyester thread is starting to match or mirror my opinion of chain sporran belts in that they can cut the cloth. They're rough. So yeah, I'm going to go off and get some correct colored 100% cotton, ideally silk, but it's getting hard for me to find silk. A certain supplier in the States or in Europe, wherever they are, suddenly decided during lockdown that Canadians don't sew with silk. Okay, that sounds like a suit decision. Yeah, so the next stage is to sew all the fell. I'm not going to put a buttonhole in it. And I'm going to use a card as I sew each seam to isolate it so that I'm sewing, with this box pleat here, I'm sewing 2, 4, 5 layers of cloth. I don't want to sew any more than that because again, if I'm sewing here and I sew through these extra layers of cloth, I can be creating complications here. And if people can do that accurately, good for them, but I really can't see any advantage to it. And if you're doing alterations, it's a real disadvantage because instead of correcting one seam, then sometimes you're correcting 3 or 4 or 5. So there we go. So I'm going to wrap this up, put it aside and I'll sort of use it as an incentive to get through my work day today, so that at the end of the day, perhaps I can treat myself by working on this a bit more. I want to get it done because, again, I'm not buying any more crappy pairs of jeans.